mentioned before, the New South Wales Premier, Mike Baird, you can see him on screen there with Chris Ullman. He's obviously had a pretty tough time of it in 2016. The year didn't start badly for Mike Baird, but it has certainly ended with a much tougher run around things like greyhound racing and the backflip there. Let's have a listen to what he's got to say.
Well, thank you, Chris, and it's a pleasure to be down at the National Press Club. Great to be here with my Deputy Premier and Minister for Primary Industries here as well. Fantastic, good to be with you all here. And whilst at this time of year we're used to the media reflecting on the year that was, in many respects giving us marks out of 10, both personally and governments, what I thought I would do was focus on something that might be missed in the year-end colour and movement. And whilst I would certainly describe 2016 as an interesting year, certainly personally gaining a number of new titles. I hadn't had titles like this before: Judas, Casino Mike, Dictator, and to add that collection of Broken Back, I certainly think it adds up to personally being an interesting year. But having said that, I think it has been fundamentally a very strong year for New South Wales. And we've charged away building significant infrastructure, schools and hospitals and transport links that people expect, and I strongly argue deserve. That's what they deserve for their governments to deliver. At the same time, as a collective, I think when you add it up, it is almost unprecedented. It is an infrastructure miracle that's going on in New South Wales, and we haven't seen the like of it in the history of our country, and that's something we're very proud to be delivering. The question is, how has this happened? And I think that's one of the challenges that we will have, reminding people that it's not automatic. All those cranes and the infrastructure being built is not something that just happens. It's taken a significant amount of work, and you can remind people to where we were, but ultimately it's come about because there is a determination from our government to deliver services and build the infrastructure that the state desperately needs. We've gone about it in two key ways. Firstly, what you have to do is get the economy moving, and that's fundamental to everything. If you have a strong economy, there's so much more you can do, and that has been the focus as we went about our work. In terms of tax incentives into businesses, workers' compensation reform, undertaking the infrastructure build, particularly targeted on housing, the infrastructure that held back. Housing, I think, is a very important part of the overall strategy. The story, as most people are familiar, New South Wales was last in the country and now leads the nation across most of the economic indicators. So that's been a strong start to what we want to do. The second part is obviously dealing with the budget. And the budget had significant challenges that we inherited. We had $10 billion worth of deficits, and we've turned that into $8 billion worth of surpluses. The net debt was forecast to be about $20 billion, and that currently sits at a strong cash position, actually cash in the bank, which obviously will be spent on infrastructure, but a very strong turnaround. At the same time, we looked at the balance sheet to see, can we do even more? And we had, through the asset recycling, an opportunity, I thought, to actually undertake this infrastructure miracle, to build infrastructure, not just filling in the gaps, but for tomorrow. Getting ahead of the curve for the first time in our living memory. And part of that, as an example, like a lease of the port, it was on our balance sheet at $3 billion. We had a capacity through the right market conditions, competitive tension, to get to $5 billion. So almost a $2 billion windfall, but all that $5 billion going into new assets for the people across New South Wales. A good example, I think, of how we have gone about the work, because the funding alongside announcements is a critical part of any government. Now, I'd strongly argue this: it's not just because governments love it to be able to talk economic credentials and financials, but this is not just a tick-the-box exercise. And I think this is an important point to note. You know, with fiscal flexibility, you actually have the capacity to spend the money where you think it needs to be spent, to build the infrastructure that needs to be built. And I think that is one of the significant hallmarks that we want to argue we have gone about. And if you think about it even further, there's actually the long-term strategic opportunity to actually tackle some of the significant underlying problems that have been a challenge and confounding even very good governments for generations. And that fiscal flexibility is what we strive very hard to achieve. And look, as I'm here to talk about today, look, under the surface and away from the gaze, there has been a huge amount that has gone on that I think is going to make a huge difference to people across the state of New South Wales. When I came in to be Premier, like many others, you actually inherit many targets. And one of the things I want to talk about is that I inherited 321 targets, all very noble. But obviously, if there's that many targets, the question is, have you got any capacity to actually achieve them? Will anyone pay attention to 321 targets? I strongly believe it's the same for the private sector, should be the same for the government, that what gets measured gets done. You need to ensure that everyone has a deep understanding of what you're trying to achieve. You measure that, you hold people accountable, and you'll start to achieve results. So part of what we did was actually return those 321, or reduce those 321 down to 12 individual priorities, and I'll come to that in a minute, but we've certainly made some good progress. The reason I think it's so important is what we forget about at times is the size, scale, influence and impact of state governments. They are very significant. When I look at the state of New South Wales in particular, obviously, our net worth is closing in on $250 billion. It's actually grown from about 145, so almost $100 billion increase in our net worth, very significant size, obviously. We are the largest employer in the country, close to 400,000 when you include the part-time employees. So it's a huge employer, 150,000 more than the Commonwealth, 180,000 more than Wesfarmers, double Woolies. So the size and scale is quite unbelievable when you think about it. But it also the impact on people, services which touch people's daily lives. 2 million regular transport customers on our Opal card, 13 million public transport trips a week. Teachers, 64,967 teachers trying to inspire, teach, instruct our kids. That is 1.18 million students across our schools on a daily basis. We have 2.7 million people presenting out of emergency departments and the complexities around that. 16,700 police officers trying to keep communities safe. And all of that scale, I think the public sort of understand what you do, but they want it to be seamless. Ultimately, they want the best governments to be silent as they go about their business, and I certainly think in part that's certainly what we've done. But I think what you can't miss with the size of that is what an opportunity. What an opportunity to make a difference to people's daily lives if given the privilege of being able to govern. And as we think about that, quite clearly, the question is how. How do you determine with all of those needs and all of that breadth, what are the priorities that a government should focus on? And what are the ones that you're going to stick to, regardless of the colour and movement on any given day? So getting from 321 down to 12, I can tell you was completely brutal. I don't want to go through the process, but when you involve every agency across government, what do you think is the most important thing? And the Cabinet to get to there, it was a very, very difficult part, but quite fulfilling. But I think the most difficult part, having done that, is actually navigating the machinery of government to ensure that the vision and these priorities actually reach all the way down to the front line and actually start to achieve results. And that really is a big challenge. And how to do that, I actually turned to someone that you wouldn't necessarily turn to in this country, but Tony Blair. And Tony Blair's reflection resonated quite deeply with me because he said this. He said he really felt that his first term was wasted. It was about almost dealing with the day-to-day around him. He felt he didn't achieve what he wanted to achieve. And that is something that I thought, I don't want to be in that position. I want to ensure that we're doing something today and doing everything possible to achieve those outcomes. So what he did in his second term is he created priorities and he established this implementation unit to ensure that they got done. And this was the model that he established. So he dedicated a central unit through Michael Barber, who's now actually Sir Michael Barber, so obviously knights and dames still work over there. But he turned to him for advice, and in setting it up, we said, let's do the same thing. So we asked how it was done, and we have done the exact same thing under his instruction. There's not really anything that I can see like it across the rest of the governments in Australia, but other governments around the world are, including Justin Trudeau. The Canadian Prime Minister is establishing something very similar right now, and other state governments across the US. But this Premier Implementation Unit sits in Department of Premier and Cabinet. There's a team of 16, and they work through all departments, helping them to make it happen. So it's not dictating, it's additional resources, and it's coming alongside the departments, analysing the issues, looking at world best practice, trying to determine what are the solutions, trialling them, and actually also going out to the front line and hearing firsthand what are we hearing, what are we seeing, what are the barriers, and how do we fix it. And that, obviously, is something that will make a real difference if we get it right. And obviously monitoring rigorously the progress, which is part of what today is. He also said that it's important that the Prime Minister or the Premier make sure that you allocate the time. You know, if you want to make sure that these priorities don't just get washed away in the day-to-day, you have to allocate the time. And we've done that. Monthly updates, quarterly 3-hour stock takes with ministers and secretaries, real ownership of the problems and the challenges, understanding the progress, and at the same time bringing cabinet ministers along by looking at cabinet. And that can be bracing. And I'll talk about the honesty in a minute, but you need to be very honest if we're not making progress. And that is something I think governments need to do more of. As part of that, we went on a very deep dive, is the term, into 3 of these priorities. So you can see it in the brochure in front of you. There's 12 and the progress to them, but 3 of them we did deep dives, and I want to reflect on 3 of those in a moment. The emergency department waiting times, the NAPLAN results for education, and also protecting vulnerable kids. Now, whilst we're only a year in, and it's really too early to determine the success or otherwise, I mean, there has been some good progress, and you can see some of the results there. What's clear, things such as the jobs targets and improving government services, and improving government services isn't just sort of getting your licences renewed. I mean, it's also, for the first time, asking everyone in New South Wales through a systematic process, well, what do you think about your health services? You know, what do you think about the schools and how they're providing? So it's every sort of government service and understanding how they're performing. Litter reduction is strong progress, and that's before we introduce a container deposit scheme, which is coming in next year. So we're confident that is sort of on track, all strong, but there's others that aren't. And I think this is part of the challenges for government. There's no point setting targets that everyone can just tick a box and move on. If you want to deliver real results and achieve real outcomes, you've got to be prepared to make them tough and to challenge everyone. Well, this is something that's not easy, but if we do it, imagine what it's like. But also be prepared to say, well, we haven't done it, but we gave it a good shot. And in the context of the media criticism that comes to that, that's something I think is worthwhile, because if you achieve some of these outcomes, I think it would be fantastic. And that's one of the things we have to be very much open to. And obviously, domestic violence reoffending is as an example of something that is still not tracking the right way for us. But we have to do more. And it's clear that the strategies we're employing to date haven't had the impact. But I can tell you we're working very hard. And that obviously is an area we have to focus on. So I do want to just quickly go through in the remaining time on 3, just to give you a tangible understanding of the power that I think this can deliver for governments through these deep dives. The first is the emergency department waiting time, something that impacts everyone across the country. And everyone personally or with family members have been there. And the target is to get to 81%, that is when you come to an emergency department, you're in and through and out within 4 hours. And that's a national sort of benchmark. We're at 81% and we're currently tracking at 74%. And that's so still some work to do. But on the back of some of the strategies we've implemented this winter, which is obviously when the flus and the gastros come, so there's troughs in performance, we actually saw that an improved performance to the point that there were 9,000 extra people that we got through compared to the previous winter. And that is a huge step forward. And some of those relate to these 3 things that we implemented. Well, firstly, as overall, it's ruthlessly going through the data, trying to understand the data. You know, what has caused this? How can we prevent it? What are some of the systems and processes we can do Even simple things such as teamwork at each hospital, regularly looking at where we sit in relation to that target and who in what part of the emergency department can take further action. But the three things we found, interestingly, poor performance on Mondays and Tuesdays. Just that came out of the data. Well, why has that happened? Well, what we found out was that there weren't discharges done in hospitals over the weekend. So it was obviously backed up, the beds are full, and emergency departments don't stop, they keep going, but the beds are full. So the bed block that was caused Monday, Tuesday took a couple of days to clear before we marched on. So solution, we'll put a discharge doctor on the weekends, and that starts to take away some of that challenge. So that was one thing that was done. Focusing on the transfer of care. So when an ambulance comes into a hospital, obviously that transfer is very important, taking a significant amount of time, a significant amount of resources from the emergency department. So a whole range of work on how we streamline that has had a huge difference. And at the same time, there's a spin-off there because there's more ambulances with more capacity to actually do the work they need to do. So that was found to be incredibly positive. But what was unexpected in this was actually the issue with some of our most vulnerable. And this came out that elderly patients who are waiting for guardianship decisions. And there was a significant number. Indeed, every year there was about 1,000 hospital beds taken up by some of our most elderly and vulnerable waiting for the decisions, and their average waiting time was 83 days. So 83 days in our hospitals. You can imagine the size and scale and impact that was. So the PIU brought together health and facts and our justice departments, and they have worked concurrently to reduce that now down to 39 days already. So it's already falling, and that produces, if you can do the maths, but 34,249 extra bed days available in the system a year. So it's a huge shift forward. Productivity benefits estimated at about $50 million, but it also puts vulnerable people back in more supporting environments rather than obviously sort of waiting in a hospital. So, that package and that deep dive showed real progress being made on one of the most difficult challenges we face. The second is in our education system. It's often talked about and lots of strategies implemented, but our focus on NAPLAN, trying to get 8% more students up into the top two bands. If we achieve it, it's an incredible achievement, and we think about the difference. I'll get to it. But the size of the system can't be underestimated. 3,137 schools, one of the biggest education systems in the world. And the PIU noted that most programs, and you think about it, they focus on the gifted or the disadvantaged. That's where the focus has been. And the question was, well, hang on, what about the forgotten middle? Is there an opportunity to give them extra resources, to give them even more opportunity to excel? And that was something which seems logical but hadn't been done, and that's where we've focused on. And look, the target in this is huge, 8% by 2019, and I think it's really important with these, not just to get stuck in the numbers, but to personalise them. So 13,300 extra students would be in the top two NAPLAN, but obviously additional opportunities, additional skills, and that is something that can't be missed. Personalising and understanding that if we get this right, those 13,300 kids have more opportunities than otherwise they would. Now, as we've gone about it, it's not a system-wide response. We've looked at it and said, okay, working with education, where are the schools with the largest middle cohort, and those particular schools where compared to their peers aren't getting the same sort of results. So we're focusing on 137 schools, and those 137, every single student in that middle cohort now has an individualised learning program, so straight down to them. And, to me, that's the power. If you can get these priorities right at a premier's desk, a cabinet table, all the way down to a school desk, well, it's working. And to me, that's what I'm most encouraged about. There's strong engagement across the sector. Indeed, there's now a waiting list of schools that want to participate in this, and the non-government sector is looking at it and wanting to participate themselves. And, I think that this, in the longer term, could be a very significant development, not just for our schools in New South Wales, but potentially across the country. The last point I'll talk about is the third one is protecting our vulnerable kids. And, I can honestly say that in this role and job, this is the area that has impacted me the most personally. The difficulty, the tragedy, the long-standing problems. Where do you start with something so complex? But again, part of this PIU, the Premier's implementation, this group of people have a capacity to help agencies to look at the same problems in a different way, to use data and their field work to, in some cases, actually analyse data that's never been looked at and never been used. And indeed, we've looked at that in this case. And I think one of the biggest challenges here, because what we're trying to do is to reduce the number of kids at risk of significant harm in terms of re-reporting. And you can think about it. If you're in the system and you're looking after these children and these families and you hand them back across to be in a position that they're re-reported, so you've left them with hope and they've come back and been re-reported and they're back at risk, it's heartbreaking. And certainly that's what our caseworkers deal with on a daily basis. And I have to say, my encouragement to every member of Parliament and indeed every member of the media, if you have the chance to go and spend a day or two with our caseworkers, you're not going to see a more incredible group of Australians or understand the challenges and complexities. I remember very clearly sitting at the back of a room watching these young caseworkers. Young's relative these days, but they were probably early 30s, dealing with this family and these children, and I didn't know myself where to turn with it, but they seemed to have an understanding, they had an empathy, they had a purpose, and it was very poignant to me that we have to do everything we possibly can to help these caseworkers, because we know if we give them the resources and support, well, these kids and families are going to have more chance, more opportunity. And to me, that's what it was all about. And I think what we saw as we started to go into this, so looking at the data and the processes that were established here, we realised quite dramatically what was going on, and that was within the system. The system was actually letting our caseworkers down, because we found, looking at the data for 2 years, 2013 to 2014, there were 10,170 cases of children that was actually closed. But of those cases that were closed, and they found this through the data, there was 2,720 of those cases where the risk for the child was still considered high or very high. And that was not surprising in the sense that what's the result? Well, about half of those kids were actually re-reported. And that was almost a gee whiz moment. Well, how have we got to a position that cases are closed? And cases are closed mean that we actually think the child's going to be fine with the family, or we've handed that child and family back across to an NGO partner. And in that context, the hope is they're fine, but the processes ensured that there were some cases closed that really shouldn't have been closed. And that's where we've focused in on, providing the opportunities and support for the caseworkers to spend the time and not hand up or close those cases where the young child has high or significantly high risk. What we found in the last 6 months is that there's been an 80% drop in the cases, in the areas that we've been focusing on, an 80% drop in the cases of those that have been closed with kids with high or very high risk. So that is a huge step forward. And I think in terms of our target, if we achieve it, there are 700 kids that won't be re-reported at risk of significant harm. And I think that's often what's lost in the hurly-burly of politics. What is it all about? And to me, it comes back, to those kids. Whether they be the kids that we're protecting from serious physical harm, whether it be the opportunities for our kids in schools, whether it be supporting those who are frail or ill. Ultimately, if governments get it right, you're saving kids, you're saving families, you're giving everyone the opportunities they deserve. And I think, as we reflect going forward, these priorities can help us to achieve it. So as I conclude, look, sometimes I get asked about moving to federal politics. I have to say that happens a lot less these days. But, you know, why would you do it? I mean, I guess there's a more sort of civilised and polite press gallery as a rule, but I think what's lost is how significant state government is. And it's about people. And those priorities I've run through, there are children, there are families on the back of them. And whether we're teaching them or inspiring them or encouraging or protecting kids, you know, what an opportunity. Whether we're curing or providing more opportunities for our health system to, on a daily basis, produce the miracles of protecting and maintaining life. Whether it be budget decisions we've made that give us a capacity to provide 60,000 more disabled residents of New South Wales or their families additional support. All of that makes an incredible difference. And sure, there are challenges that come in politics, there are challenges that come in government, but my strong argument is they're all worthwhile. And you just have to look at the cover of that priorities and look at that young girl or that young boy and think, well, if we can make a difference to them, it's all worthwhile. And certainly I know my colleagues in the New South Wales Cabinet that are here and not here, we all think that very strongly. This is an unbelievable opportunity we have, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be in government. We're determined to make the most of it, and we're determined to make the most improvement we can to people's lives. And these Premier's priorities, when people reflect back, I'm sure people will talk about the infrastructure, but my hope is they look back at these priorities and think, well, this is something we're going to continue because we know the good that they've achieved. And my hope is next governments, whenever they come, they do exactly the same thing. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Premier. I guess you'll get a chance now to judge whether the New South Wales Press Gallery is more or less civilised than the one that we have here in Canberra. I think you'd probably get a fairly fierce argument from your colleagues on the Hill about that particular one, but we'll start with 2CC.
Premier Mike Baird, welcome to Canberra. Tim Shaw from 2CC Radio Canberra. We do talk radio. Talk radio is pretty influential. You get the heartbeat of a nation and certainly of a city. Bob Catter said that orange was the new black. That was a wake-up call for the Baird government. You're the CEO of the Premier State of New South Wales, and your CFO, Gladys Berejiklian, has done a great job on the budget. But how could sales and marketing in New South Wales get it so wrong? The backlash on council mergers, the backlash certainly on greyhounds, and presently the outrageous overcharging on CTP compulsory third-party green slips. New South Wales drivers are having trouble just affording to put the vehicle on the road. So looking ahead and consulting the sales and marketing department, what are your answers on things like housing affordability, on about affordability of even driving on a road? Because some people don't want to catch your tram in New South Wales. It's a great state. How will you make it even greater over the next 3 years? Thank you.
Well, that's almost an entire state government agenda you've got there. So, look, Tim, let me quickly try and respond. Yes, look, orange. There are huge sort of lessons in that, but at the same time, I mean, some of those decisions, the greyhound decision, we don't back away in any way from standing up against the animal cruelty that we saw, and it was barbaric, and we cannot go back to that. And, you know, where we got it wrong, as acknowledged, was my expectation, Cabinet's expectation, was when the community saw that report, that was a conclusion they'd drawn. They didn't. They certainly were against the animal cruelty, but the broad sense was, actually, why don't you, though, give the industry one last chance to deal with this? We don't want to see it, give them one last chance. So the principle was something we still strongly uphold, but the method of getting there was where we got it wrong. And look, I think no government's perfect. You don't get everything right, and you have to acknowledge when you do, and certainly I acknowledge that. I'm not perfect in any way, and you know, that was a mistake on my part. But I think in terms of regional New South Wales, that certainly had an impact and had an impact on Orange, but we already started to move in relation to that. That doesn't mean you move into a populist agenda, either. You have to still make decisions that are in the long-term good of the state. And, part of that, councils is a good example where you look at the examples. I mean, you go to Victoria or you go to New Zealand, you go to Queensland. Yes, there's colour and movement around the issue, but ultimately those councils are delivering good things to their community, smaller head offices, but more capacity for additional services, downward pressure on rates for the community in the longer term. And we've got over 40 councils in Sydney versus 1 in Brisbane. So that is something, and we have consulted and engaged on the way, but you need to ensure you stand up for it. I also think that the Liberal Party has a proud tradition through Menzies and John Howard of the forgotten people. And there's no great science to that other than continually listening to the forgotten people, to mainstream Australia. What are their concerns, and make sure that you listen and respond. And I think that they will respond if there is essential listening. And I think that part of our challenge was that the community, reality or not, thought that we weren't listening, and that's a very challenging and damaging thing. So we have to work hard, and we've got the Deputy Premier here who's, over the past few days, has been out in many regional communities doing exactly that. And we will continue to respond and listen and deliver policies that I think are in the long-term interest. So we've changed. We're continuing to listen, but at the same time, issues such as the CTP, that is a real issue, and we've got announced a reform agenda that we're getting on with, so that we are dealing with those concerns that you're hearing. So I think any government that thinks it gets it right all the time is in trouble. Any government that actually allows a perception that you're not listening to take hold is in trouble. But I think that we've got the opportunity for those learners to keep doing the good work we're doing, and that's important.
Has it become more difficult to govern? It's impossible to compare eras, and of course you weren't there in the past, and I'm sure past politicians would say they had a difficult time. There seems to be around the world an impatience with business as usual in governments, and a feeling that if they don't like what they're getting, people will make a change, and there is more noise around governments, more avenues for complaint than there ever have been before. And you've experienced the highs and lows, as you say, an interesting year, and perhaps the Chinese curse style of interesting year. So could you reflect on that? Is it more difficult to govern today, and what's been your experience, your personal experience this year? Because it must be punishing as well.
Yeah, look, I think, it's hard to compare because I haven't been there. I'm here right now, so I can talk about the current experience. And there's many platforms for groups who are resistant to you, or maybe don't like you, or they're against a particular issue or policy position you're taking. There's huge opportunity for colour and movement across those. So rather than spending your day focusing on these, in terms of the priorities that you're spending the day fighting the fires that are emerging from all these issues. So the agenda becomes your response to the concerns and the noise that's coming from these groups. So how you balance that, look, I haven't got all the answers on, but you need to understand, though, that these cannot be ignored. So from a diary point of view, the things that matter, your key policy priorities and agendas, which is the same for any sort of CEO and leader of any organisation, that's the way you're successful. You stick to those. You have to deal with this colour and movement, no doubt about it, but don't deal with it to the point that you become so obsessed by what today's headlines are doing and saying that you forget actually why you're there and what the focus is. So it's undoubtedly become more challenging, but as I explained, I think the opportunities still remain immense.
News.com.au.
Malcolm Farr from news.com.au. Premier, thanks for your address. Your intention for a reshuffle early in the new year has raised some concerns about instability and uncertainty at the level of departments, who's going to be the next minister, at the level of perhaps there might be a couple of by-elections on the horizon. And also because of the delay, despite your colour glossy set of KPIs, that you might be using a delay to reassess your own position. How are you going to manage those uncertainties?
I'll just tell everyone to relax. So, yeah, look, I mean, there's there are a lot of things that we are doing and very proud of what we're doing. I mean, yesterday we announced a major upgrade of a significant hospital. It's going to make a huge difference. The Deputy Premier is out in regional New South Wales assessing the next projects and priorities that we need to deliver across regional New South Wales. So we are focusing in on our job. All the ministers remain the same. There's a huge amount to do, and we're going to keep doing it. Yes, that's something that we'll consider next year, but there's a lot to do in the meantime.
Fairfax.
Thanks, Mr. Baird. Michael Koziel from the Sydney Morning Herald. Do you agree with your Planning Minister, Rob Stokes, that firstly, New South Wales has basically done, or was doing what it's required to do on housing, boosting supply, and now it's up to the feds essentially to reform negative gearing to make it more affordable for first home buyers? So do you agree with him, and if you could outline your reasons why? Just secondly, what do you make of the immediate resistance to that idea from Malcolm Turnbull, Scott Morrison and the rest of Canberra? And then if I could just fit in one more, which is that, as you alluded to earlier, there is a lot of speculation about your future. Can you guarantee that you will be New South Wales Premier in 1 year?
Well, the last one is no, because obviously I'm the Premier on the back of my party room. But my intention, of course, is to remain. So that's my intention. You're always there on the basis of your party room. And ultimately, the people of this state, I mean, they had their say a couple of years ago. They'll have a say in another 2 years' time. In relation to the negative gearing, look, this is a really interesting point, I think, for all of us to actually reflect on. Rob Stokes, for those that know, is an incredibly credentialed. I don't think there's ever been a planning minister more credentialed in the history of this country than Rob Stokes. Indeed, he's currently doing additional master's work at Oxford while he's undertaking his job to ensure that he's listening from the best people across the world to ensure that those practices are being imported into his thinking and what we're doing here in this state. So he's an incredible asset to the state, and he was making a contribution to one of the biggest policy challenges we have, housing affordability. And if you follow that debate, what immediately happened, hang on, right, so is Rob Stokes not backing in the Turnbull government? You beauty, this is a great news story, off we go, we run away with it. The federal opposition comes out and then points to it and says, well, Rob Stokes is against the Liberals, this is something that we need to sort of trumpet about. Like, everyone just come back a minute and say, okay, we have a credentialed planning minister making an incredible contribution to one of the biggest complex challenges we have. Why don't we just take a back seat and say, okay, in terms of what has been presented, is that something that we should consider further? And really, that's my position on it. He has made a contribution in terms of the overall housing affordability. We're doing everything we possibly can in terms of supply, no doubt about it. And when we came in, just before we came in, approvals just over 25,000. They've gone past 75,000, a record. But that doesn't change overnight. You need to keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. He has now said, okay, as part of that, negative gearing, potentially do you put the incentives towards social goods, so potentially looking at affordable housing and other measures as part of it. That's a contribution to the debate. No, that's all it is. And, my wish is that that's the way we started to look at some of these. I'm not being naive enough to not think that there'll be political pickups and people will use that. But I'd rather that the focus was, well, that's an interesting idea. Let's take that further. And certainly from my point of view, I would want to see the work. The federal government has rightly identified a number of concerns with negative gearing, the impact on rents and what that would do in terms of affordability. That needs to be taken into account and understood. But this additional contribution, well, what about this as part of an overall package where we could all work on a solution? And look, I know that partisan politics is a brutal reality, but I think we need to do more as leaders to try and get to a position. Don't immediately pick up your political badge. Just don't do it. Just stop and say, well, actually, there's some wisdom in this. It might not have come from my side, but, that actually is something that we should consider as part of the overall mix. And, my hope is that's what we do more of.
Australian Associated Press.
Premier Daniel McCulloch from Australian Associated Press. I just wanted to pick up on a theme that you ran in your speech earlier, and it was on seamless and silent government. It seems to have been a fairly noisy and bruising political year for yourself and not least from your own coalition party room. So I was just wondering, are you confident that you've got the coalition support and enough political capital in the tank to deliver on your suite of reforms by 2019?
Well, yes, but it's a fair point. I mean, as I've said to my coalition party room, there's no point having political capital unless you spend it. I mean, ultimately, you cannot spend it. You can do nothing. But then, what a waste. When I went through those priorities, didn't I give you a sense of what an opportunity this actually is to make a difference? Now, part of the decisions you have to make, are tough. And you need to be prepared to make those. I mean, Menzies himself would argue that, you need to look at an issue, and once you've determined that it is the right thing to do, then the obligation on you is to convince the public of the merits of your position or face the electoral consequences. Now, I think that has to be the reality of any leader. Surely this is what you want. You don't want to be in a position where we, as a government, are just thinking, okay, we've got 2019 coming, we just need to do everything we possibly can to win that election. I think that was one of the powers we had in 2015, that we realised as a cabinet it was going to be tough, but if we won the election, what needs to be done, what could we do for the state? And I think that mindset is what gave us, and every single member of cabinet, was a tough thing to do, every single member of government was a tough thing to do, but the least of the poles and wires, we knew that if we did it, the state would be different for a generation on the back of the infrastructure we built. So we have to keep doing that. That doesn't mean we don't listen. That doesn't mean at times we don't change our course, which we've done. But I think that you will see us continue to make decisions that I think we collectively agree are in the interests of our state in the long term. And that doesn't mean that every decision is going to be widely applauded. Indeed, there could be opposition. But my hope is that people of the state see through that.
Australian Financial Review.
Hi, Joanna Mather from the Financial Review. I hope you'll forgive me. Could you be just a little bit more specific? Do you and your government think negative gearing is a problem, and will you pursue that with Canberra?
Well, I think I've answered that. My answer is yes, it should be considered. Have I got a position yet on it? No, I don't. I haven't seen the modelling and understand the broad impacts. But if there is modelling or an approach that suggests that there is an impact, a positive impact on affordability, well, of course that's something you should consider. That doesn't mean that I'm for or against the Turnbull government in their position. It's just saying that is something that I think that we should consider, and that's what our planning minister did.
Keating Media.
Premier Michael Keating from Keating Media. Following up on my colleague Tim's question on council amalgamations, do you think that people, especially those in the bush, have a higher sense of ownership of their local governments that is being expropriated by your government? And how do you think you can bring people who are most affected by those changes along with you to support them?
Yeah, and look, we have to do more in that, and part of it, I mean, at the moment there are some councils that haven't merged, so I think there is a fear of the unknown. Of the councils that have come together, we're seeing real benefits that are actually being achieved, and I'll give you one example: Dubbo and Wellington. Obviously Wellington was a much smaller council. You had a challenge actually getting DAs approved because there was a single staff member, and when they went away on holidays, it obviously delayed the process. Approval times are running in the hundreds in terms of days. Dubbo was actually at 40 days. So now, all of a sudden, Wellington is actually receiving that benefit. By councils coming together, there's actually road contracts, insurance contracts, procurement contracts, where millions and millions of dollars have been saved that give those merged councils capacity to put in more services, build infrastructure, or put downward pressure on rates. So over time, I think that people will see that. One of the challenges is those that haven't yet merged, there is the fear of the unknown, and the concerns have been raised. So we do have to do a better job communicating that, understanding and clearly articulating the benefits that will come and bring people with us. But you look at those councils that have come together, the vast majority, on most days, are very happy with what they're seeing.
Sky News.
Premier, thanks for your speech today. David Spears from Sky News. You stuck your neck out last year on the GST, backing an increase. Federal government decided not to in the end. You've stuck your neck out a little bit here today on the issue of negative gearing, saying you do think it should be considered, should be looked at. What do you think about your federal counterparts when it comes to tax reform? Would you like to see them be a bit more courageous than they are, rather than shutting down some of these ideas? And secondly, can I ask you, will you accept the New South Wales Police recommendation on the Adler 7-shot firearm for declassification?
Yeah, are you allowed 2 questions or not? You just get one. In question time, you wouldn't get that through.
He's not Sky, he's also a director of the club. So.
Look, tax reform is difficult whenever you get to it, whenever you start it, whenever you stop it, whenever you need to start it. I mean, it is a very difficult issue, and I think the federal government had made clear their position, and they went to the election and they won a mandate on the back of that. So in terms of changes beyond what they have argued for, they're not going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. And already they're putting their change, I mean, the superannuation changes have gone through, so already their measures that they have said they will do, they are doing. In the longer term, you know, where do we get to and what does it mean? I think we will inevitably come back to it. And the reason I think we'll come back to it is because the biggest challenge that we have is health. So if you look at the costs of health, and every state treasury and the Commonwealth will tell you, if you look at the costs of health from 2020 to 2030, it is unfunded to the tunes of billions and billions and billions of dollars. Now, there either needs to be some form of economic miracle where our economic growth surges to the moon, or massive efficiencies are found that no one can see, or you are going to have to do something to either promote and stimulate the economy or look at the revenue mix to deliver that service. So I think it is inevitable we come back to that. What the tax is and what the mix is and how that is determined, that is obviously for a later day, but I think it's inevitable that we will get back there.
And the Adler, will you take the recommendation on the declassification from the New South Wales Police?
So Cabinet hasn't considered our position yet. That is, I understand it's on the COAG agenda, so Cabinet will obviously be considering that beforehand. But you know, we've been very strong on this. I mean, New South Wales currently supports the ban. We do not support in any way watering down the gun laws, and obviously we'll consider what is being brought forward on the COAG agenda.
The Guardian.
Hello, Premier. Thank you for your speech. Just while we're on federal issues, another one if I may, there are a number of Liberal MPs from Sydney who have expressed concern either publicly or privately in recent times about the renewed debate in Canberra over 18C protections in the Racial Discrimination Act, and also recently about Peter Dutton's comments in relation to Malcolm Fraser's immigration policy. I wonder, as a senior New South Wales Liberal, whether you share those concerns or whether you're more sanguine than some of your state colleagues.
So, look, I mean, the position on 18C, I think the Prime Minister is absolutely right to try and reach a consensus on that. I mean, myself and the former Premier long stated our position. We don't think there needs to be a change on that, but obviously there are community concerns, and the more consensus you can get on those issues, the better. So I think he's done absolutely the right thing to consider that through the parliamentary inquiry. On the matter of refugees, look, that's not in my remit as a state premier, but you know, my position has been very clear on this, and you know, my view is manage what you can manage, and I think we've been quite strong in this, in the sense that I obviously strongly supported the additional intake. Why is that important? Well, the states actually take and are taking those refugees, and we've made good progress on that intake personally. We've also provided additional support in terms of transport concessions and access to TAFE for the refugees. So I think there is an obligation, you know, on a government as you go through it. Yes, we've got an improved economy and more fiscal flexibility, but part of that obligation, I strongly believe, is you must look after the most vulnerable. And, you know, there is a obligation for us as part of that mix to look after those who are refugees. So, I'm not going to sort of comment on federal positions or in relation to that, other than respond with the actions I've taken on the issue.
The age. Okay. You sure? Sorry.
It's been a little while
say
since. Yes, a few years indeed. Misha Schubert, one of the directors of the National Press Club. Premier, I wondered if one of the things that struck me in listening to you speak was a number of times you being willing to say, look, we didn't get this entirely right, or we haven't made as much progress as I would want. How hard is it in the modern, fractious, contested political culture that we seem to have now to say that freely and apparently quite easily? And is that a skill that has to be learnt?
Well, it depends how you measure success on. I think the only way, picking the negative gearing debate. So, I haven't said one way or another here today. Other than, yes, let's consider that as part of the overall challenge we're facing in housing affordability now. That is something we need to do. I don't care whether that's come from Liberal, Labor, National Party or another stakeholder. If there is something sensible that contributes to one of the big challenges we have, of course we have to listen to it. And the public would expect nothing less than that. In relation to how you're achieving, if I produced a Premier's priorities that were just an election pamphlet, trying to set targets that you knew you were always going to achieve and sort of going around saying, aren't we wonderful? Well, people see through that as well. I think what the community wants is they want you to go about your job as much as you possibly can, make a difference as much as you can to people's lives, but they also want you to be honest. And, some of these are really hard and we're not doing well. So that's an opportunity for me to go back to the secretaries and the ministers and say, we have to do better here. Have we tried everything? What else is it we need to do? And if you think about that, that potentially leads to much better outcomes because you are happy to share your progress, positive and negative, and focusing in on the negative to try and do better. And obviously the debate is, from a media point of view, it's very easy to attack. And if you look at, I didn't see them all the reports, but basically the thrust of some of the media reports today on these priorities was that still a long way to go to achieve the results and that sort of thing, which is fair enough. But I think that if you genuinely want to achieve some of these outcomes, you've got to be prepared for that. We were the first government to trial social benefit bonds. And this concept of taking risks was something that I spoke about. We have to be prepared to fail because if this works, the impact on social policy is not just state changing, it's world changing. So why aren't we prepared to take a risk there? And obviously at this stage, actually the social benefit, both of them that we've started, and there's more on the way, have actually been successful. But another one we tried was the eco-nets in terms of up on the north coast as potentially a marine-friendly way to protect swimmers. That didn't work. Well, that's fine. We tried. You've got to be prepared to try and fail. And one of the best things that I had I've seen from the business days was you fail your way to success. And I think that's probably not as easy for government to do because if you're failing every day, it becomes very difficult. But is that obvious? They are trying. But you have to be prepared to fail as part of the mix and prepared to defend it and prepared to take the risk. Otherwise, you don't take the risks and you don't try and achieve outcomes that are incredibly difficult to achieve because you think, well, we're just going to criticise for why would you do it. So I don't know whether it's learned, but I think it's the right thing to do.
The Australian.
Premier Sarah Martin from The Australian, thank you very much for your speech. Just on tax reform that you have mentioned in response to David's question, given you've said 2020 starts to be the crunch time for health funding, would you like to see the Turnbull government tackle this issue in this parliament? And given the disaster that was the conversation over GST earlier in the year, how could the Turnbull government approach tax reform differently?
Well, I include myself in that. I don't just include the government and the opposition. I think all of us can learn through that process. And that's one of the advantages we have, is that we do have a couple of years, I think, before we start to have those debates and that discussion. So obviously learning kind of what went wrong as part of this process and preparing the way for the future, I think we can all play a role in that. And I think, again, it's not just tax reform for the sake of tax reform. You need to bring it back. What is it that we're trying to deal with, and how do we impact people's lives on the back of these decisions? So I'd strongly argue that if people are concerned about their health care, and you told everyone in the country that, look, at the moment, in the long term, your health care is not funded, and the size and scale of it is quite frightening, I think many more people would be open to various tax reform options that help address that. And that to me is, I think, part of the learning of where the debate will go. But obviously, it's not something that'll happen in the current term.
And if anything was to happen this time around, it would have to be a consensus of the states, surely. Yeah. First, you would have to come with every single state on the same page.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the challenges, no doubt about it. That there were various views across states, across various measures, but I think consensus will be built on the back of the fiscal reality of the health challenge we're facing. I strongly believe that.
One last question, that's to one of our directors, Tony Melville.
Yeah, Tony Melville, Director of the National Press Club. 457 visas. State governments are among the largest user of 457 visas, particularly doctors and, let's say, nurses these days. What are your views on the current discussion in Canberra about 457 visas? And do you have concerns that maybe all this talk could lead to further unnecessary regulation, from your perspective?
Well, look, I mean, that's one I'll leave to my Canberra colleagues. But I think the 457 plays a role. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I've seen various skills and expertise brought in on the back of those visas, so I wouldn't want to be in a position where that was shut down, because it's an important part of a prosperous economy that's part of the global economy. So, my strong view is, whilst it's up to the federal government to manage, that, we need to support it and continue it, because I think it's got a critical role.
So I have to ask at the end of this, and you talked about coming to Canberra yourself, Canberra Press Gallery, New South Wales Press Gallery, vote?
Look, it's a tie.
And what about leaving New South Wales to come to Canberra yourself?
Well, it's a lovely place for a holiday, yeah.
And that's where we'll make an end to this. Could you please thank the Premier very much for coming?
It's Mike Baird there, the New South Wales Premier. The best part of the speech, I thought, Christina Keneally, was the ending, having a dig at Canberra.